right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, you all are warmed up. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we are not only welcoming you all, but we're celebrating the new and improved Student Success Summit. Our theme this year is Thriving Together, which is really stressing the importance of us as a community coming together to strengthen our cross-campus collaborations. My name is Ashley Prelo, and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Student Success, Student Thriving, and Retention. And of course, this has been a project that has been dear and near to my heart, to not just have it be something where, staff can come together, graduate levels and undergraduate levels to come together, but we're actually strategizing about what this year will look like and the plans that will come ahead. So the agenda that we have is pretty packed. We actually have over 300 people now registered, whether you're in person or you're online. We welcome you, and we hope that you can take advantage of everything that we have to offer today. With that said, if you have not already, please look to your neighbor, front of you, behind you, whatever it may be. Give yourself a quick introduction to the people next to you. And if you're online, please make sure you introduce yourself in the chat. Oh, you guys are definitely ready for these deep conversations that we're going to have today. Thank you for doing your introductions. I also wanted to, before we begin, just to bring us back up here for just a second, I wanted to thank our Student Success Summit Planning Committee, because without them, we would not be here today. This would not be a successful event. So I wanted to thank, and raise your hand if you're in the room, but Janelle Clothier, we have Julie Zito, Kiera Robinson, Michael Brown, Andrew T., and Anna Olson, my partner in crime. So thank you for giving them a round of applause, because again, we would not be here today if it weren't for their help and support. So as we transition to talking a little bit more about logistics, I'm going to turn it over to Anna Olson.
Thank you, Ashley. I am Anna Olson. I am the Assistant Vice Provost of the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning, and it's really great to see all of you, and those of you who are online. Hi. So I share Ashley's belief that cross-campus collaboration is key in really fulfilling the mission that all of us share, supporting our students, helping them thrive, helping them succeed. And you're going to have another chance to do this at the August faculty workshops, which actually are integrated with the Success Summit tomorrow, and then continue this Thursday and next Wednesday. And there's still time to register. It's for all faculty, staff, and graduate students as well. So you can find the registration link on our website. CTRL, you can actually just Google it and you'll find it. And so a few words about the logistics, like Ashley mentioned. So we are using sign-in sheets. So if you're in person at the summit today and tomorrow, if you could please check your name off the lists. This will help us and the presenters connect with you after the sessions. If you're a virtual attendee, you can connect through the Zoom chat. And we have facilitators in all rooms who will communicate your questions to the presenters there. And then last but not least, if you could please tell us what you think. So fill out the evaluation form either using your phone and the QR code or this little paper form at the end of each session today. And with that, I will just turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you, Anna. And then without further ado, who better than to kick us off today than our new visionary leader and 16th president of American University. I'd love to formally welcome President John Alger.
Good morning, everybody. Great to be with you, and as well as our friends online. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And thank you to Anna and Ashley for their leadership. Really appreciate what you guys do. You know, it's really inspiring for me as your brand new president to see so many of you engaged on this important issue as we start this new academic year. And I love this theme of the summit, thriving together, because it tells me a lot about what's important to this community as we go forward. And whether you're a brand new president or staff member, anybody else brand new to AU besides me in the room? All right, welcome to you guys too. Thank you. But whether you're brand new or a longtime staff member or one of our esteemed faculty members, we know that there's no other issue that unites us more than student success. It's at the core, of course, of everything that we do, right? And I have to say it's been a personal focus in my career in higher education, and certainly over the last 12 years when I served as president of James Madison University. At JMU, I intentionally spent a lot of time interacting with students in and outside the classroom. I co-taught a leadership seminar so that I could stay in close touch with student perspectives and experiences. I knew that was important as a leader. And I tried to serve as an informal mentor to a lot of our students, including at that institution for some of our Valley Scholars, which was a program for first-generation students that my wife and I helped to found shortly after I arrived at JMU. One of those Valley Scholars, Ayam, at our farewell event, actually told my wife and me how our interest and belief in her had changed her life. She said, look, the two of you took the time to listen to my hopes and dreams, and this was starting in middle school when she entered the program, and she felt that the university genuinely cared about her, and it therefore gave her the confidence to explore new fields, to push herself, and to eventually consider new career opportunities. And she has since graduated from college. And then just a couple of weeks ago, I had a Zoom meeting with another former student named Nico who wants to go to law school. Anybody else go to law school besides me? No other recovering lawyers? We're not so bad, I promise. But Nico just kept thanking me over and over again because he said just the fact that I took the time to listen, to hear about his hopes, his dreams, his thoughts for the future, to give him candid feedback, that precious time together was so important. He kept saying, I'll remember this for the rest of my life. And these are the types of moments that I know are occurring all across this campus every day. And what that tells me is that the personal touch matters, that relationships are at the heart of our educational mission. So yes, we're going to hear about data and statistics and theory, but we don't ever want to forget about that importance of personal relationships and the personal touch. Now, we know here in this room collectively we've got a lot of experience, certainly in dealing with student thriving, but we also know that we face some significant challenges and headwinds right now as we try to stay focused on student success, whether that's here at American University or in higher education more generally, right? These challenges, I don't need to tell you, include things like shifting demographics, financial pressures, and serious public questions about the value proposition for higher education in a rapidly changing global economy. And these challenges are precisely why this kind of convening is so important. It's our great responsibility and opportunity to prepare that next generation of students to face these challenges as creative and resilient problem solvers. So the question for us is, how do we best support these future leaders and change makers at American University and beyond? Now, this is not a new focus for American University. I'm well aware of that. Under the leadership of President Burwell, you certainly emphasize the whole student and student thriving. And some of these efforts to be student-centered are really quite visible on campus, like the Meltzer Center for Athletic Performance, the Student Wellbeing Commons, and renovations to the Mary Graydon Center. So the campus is literally shifting to be focused on student thriving and the total student experience. But other efforts are equally important and perhaps less visible. And these are the approaches that include an intentional focus on how we interact with our students on a daily basis. Do we take the time to really try to get to know them, to hear their hopes and dreams, to offer words of encouragement and support? What are we doing to foster intellectual curiosity and humility and to build community? Those are the questions we should each be asking ourselves each and every day. And this gathering is a golden opportunity to help us to think in that way as we go forward and to share some success stories and strategies as we go forward. So I know we have a great program that's going to help us to start this academic year. And of course, we have some great student success champions who are going to be sharing lessons learned here on campus. I also was intrigued by the Spark Tank conversation that sounds like it has the potential to inspire new ideas and solutions that can only be created through collaborative dialogue and conversation. But first, we are really, really excited this morning because we have a couple of renowned experts who are here with us from EAB to talk about student success and who will help us to frame our discussions on what it takes to ensure that all students have the tools to thrive physically, mentally, and socially, and are set on a path to succeed not just in careers, but in life. First, we have Sally Amoruso, who is the Chief Partner Officer for EAB and a very trusted education partner and partner organization for us with a mission to make education smarter and our communities stronger. I like that, make education smarter. At EAB, Sally leads efforts across the firm and with EAB's partner institutions like AU and, incidentally, like JMU on enrollment and student success, and she spearheads, very importantly to me personally, EAB's presidential engagement, personally advising hundreds of university presidents. I have had the great privilege of working with Sally for a number of years now, and she's still here, thank goodness, and can personally attest to her strategic insights and knowledge across the sector. She also, very importantly for all of us, serves on AU's Board of Trustees, and we are really blessed to have that kind of leadership on our board. So thank you, Sally, for being here. We also have with us Ed Venit, Sally's colleague, who is EAB's Managing Director for Strategic Research. Did I get that right, Ed? Very good. Ed manages the firm's student success research and leads the development and dissemination of best practices for increasing graduation and retention rates. Very important, not just getting students in the door, but making sure that they succeed and get out the door ready for life and careers. Ed is an expert on data analytics and student success technologies, and we'll be hearing more about that. So we are delighted to have both of them. And I should also mention one other colleague who I've worked with for years from EAB who's here today, I guess in the cheering section, Hirsch Steinberg. Would you give them a wave, Hirsch? Who's going to be working with us at American University going forward. So thank you all so much for being here. Take it away, and thank you all for coming this morning. Great to be with you.
Good morning, Eagles. I'm going to try to get us back onto the right slide. Correct me if the slides have a mind of their own. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going into my second year as a trustee, and I've had the opportunity to really appreciate what a special place, what a special institution American is. But as President Alger points out, there are some challenges, there are some headwinds, there are some opportunities in front of us. And Ed and I are going to try to contextualize those with a view of how those headwinds are actually impacting the entire sector. So we'll be able to understand our own opportunities and challenges vis-a-vis what the entire sector is experiencing. This draws from a body of research that we do every year at EAB called our State of the Sector. This year we called it Reckoning with Relevance, and you will understand why that title is so apropos. I will also mention just a little bit about myself. I'm the child of immigrants, so while not a first-gen college student, I was sort of first-gen-like is what we call it. I was a Pell student. I have two non-consumers of higher ed living in my house right now, a 24-year-old son, a 22-year-old daughter. One was a non-consumer. The other actually stopped out after COVID. She was that class of 2020, graduating in 2020, and did a semester and stopped out. They are both musician artists as well, so that certainly comes into it. But what we are going to talk about today, we talk about at the dinner table every night. So believe me, these issues are very near and dear to my heart. We also made a game time decision to invite you all to ask questions. These slides are very data rich. I don't want this to be a keynote presentation. I'd much rather have a keynote discussion with you. So I invite you to interrupt, to ask questions. If any of the data isn't clear, please raise your hand, but I am going to ask that you come to the mics to ask the questions so that our friends who are joining us virtually will be able to hear the questions as well. All right.
Say, Bobby, bow.
And there's a future eagle right on the line. Right, Evelyn? Yes. Future eagle. There we go. All right, so let me dive in. 4 different categories of trends that we're going to touch on today. The first is the public perception of higher ed. The second, very important, enrollment and demographics, and there's some major shifts that are happening. The third, the financial pressure on the business model of the higher ed institution itself. And then Ed is going to take over the mic and talk about academic preparedness and mental health. This is quite a time that we are living in, where higher ed is really caught up in what we might call the culture wars. So we have had affirmative action overturned. We have DEI bans across the US. We're quite fortunate to be in DC, but we have many partners where they cannot use those letters anymore, right, to do the important work of supporting students and promoting equity and inclusion. We have professors who are not able to teach critical race theory, who have been teaching it for 20, 30 years. In an election year, we're going to have a lot of attention on student loans and Biden's efforts to enact the student loan forgiveness. You might think that that's a good thing, but it actually puts a spotlight on student loans and the burden of student loans more generally. And there is a lot of misinformation about that as well. Challenges to tenure, particularly the Georgia university system, and then all of the anti-woke legislation. This has really put higher ed into the crosshairs of the media. Higher ed's value increasingly being called into question by popular media as well as the trades. Time magazine, these are just some headlines. Time magazine, how America started to fall out of love with college degrees. Inside Higher Ed, recapturing American higher ed's lost promise. Forbes, wake up higher education, the degree is on the decline. Fortune, Gen Zers don't see the point in getting a degree. Here's how to fix the ROI of college. And even The Economist, which is usually quite balanced, was your degree really worth it? So our researchers wanted to tackle this head on to see if the data actually supported some of the narratives out there. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every one of the narratives, but I do want to call out a few. And we are going to share these slides and follow up to anyone who would like. I will note that for each of these headlines, you'll see that we've, in blue, created links to the source material, so that if you were interested in going to the source material, getting deeper into the data, these links will take you there. First headline, which we've heard quite a bit about, is the cost of college has exploded. When actually on an inflation-adjusted net cost basis, it's declined 2.6 to 4% since 2019, and it only increased 1.5% annually for the decade prior. That students are increasingly basing their decisions on cost. Well, actually, when you look at the different segments of higher ed, the low-cost options saw the greatest decline, particularly across COVID and coming out of COVID, with 2 years down 16%, and 4 years, four-year regional institutions, down 4%. That a college degree equates to lifelong debt? Well, we know that most borrowers owe less than $25,000, and that is less than the cost of a car these days. The ROI of a college degree, that the ROI is declining. This is some of the work out of Tony Carnevale's shop at Georgetown. Actually, the wage premium is at a near decades-long high, with bachelor's degree holders earning 88% more than high school grads across their lifetime. I actually point this out to my son regularly at dinner. that the liberal arts degrees are a waste of money. You know, I hear it said that the liberal arts doesn't prepare you for your first job, but it prepares you for your fifth job. And when you look at the wage growth across a person's career, this actually bears out. So while slower to start, liberal arts grads typically experience rapid wage growth in their late 30s and 40s, the fastest growth, actually, of any college degree. That only prestigious selective colleges provide value. Well, actually, 5 of the 10 top-ranked institutions based on economic mobility have admit rates over 50%. That degree holders aren't any better off. Well, we talked about the wage premium, but college grads also report higher rates of job satisfaction, financial well-being, and health. Skip over that one. This was interesting. Gen Zers are more skeptical about the value of higher education. Well, only 54% of Gen Zers believe there are well-paying jobs for high school grads. That compares to 63% of millennials and 75% of baby boomers. This one actually was surprising to me. The headline that perceptions of higher ed are increasingly partisan. Republicans are more likely than Democrats, 60% versus 50%, to agree that Americans can get an affordable, high-quality college education. I'm going to skip over the next one and go to employers not caring about degrees anymore. You all have probably heard, you know, Google does not require a college degree. A lot of the tech firms have come out with similar statements. And we have seen job postings that don't require a degree increasing very rapidly, 240% faster than those requiring one. But when we look at the hiring data, that's actually quite different. So the actual hiring for those roles without a college degree is only 3% faster. So by and large, employers are still hiring degree holders. And then finally, the big move online has decreased the quality of education. Well, only 29% of students feel that fully online programs are worse than fully in-person, and employers are increasingly having a favorable view of online education. So we might look at this, particularly the academics in the room, and say, our work is done. The data disproves all of these headlines, right? But unfortunately, the narratives out there are having an impact, regardless of whether they are true or not. The echo chamber's impact is particularly seen on enrollment decisions, where we see recent high school grads becoming less likely to pursue post-secondary education. Those are the bar charts on the upper left-hand side. So in 2016, nearly 70% of high school grads sought a college education. In 2022, that was down to 62%. This is what we call the non-consumer trend, right? Across the bottom, what you see is sort of a snapshot of these current non-consumers. Our researchers were interested. What do these non-consumer students and their families, what do they look like? Are they similar or different to the students that actually pursue a college education? They do tilt male, so 59% male. Hispanics are overrepresented at 27%. 60% are living with parents or grandparents. One of the shocking data points to me is 1 in 3 are unemployed or not looking for work, because my assumption was that this must be the job market. It's such a tight labor market right now, and at least in California where I live, you can make $20 an hour working at McDonald's, right? So this must have an influence, and I do think it is having an influence, but it's not the entire story here. 1 in 3 are unemployed or not looking for work. We are actually doing some active data right now, getting deeper into these non-consumers. We did a survey of them, and we're just analyzing those insights right now. What's not shown on this slide is one of the other surprising takeaways from that survey. While this is largely lower income families, the fastest growing group of non-consumers, affluent families. That is the segment of the non-consumers that is growing the most rapidly. So what can we do? right? How can we break through the noise of those very damaging narratives? Our researchers found a couple of case studies that I'm going to share with you, and then we actually have quite a bit of other research here. So again, to the extent that it's of interest to anyone, happy to share this. This is just a highlights reel, if you will. But the Indiana Commission of Higher Education did some interesting focus groups around how to convey the value of higher education. And what they found, unfortunately, for those of us who love data, is that a hard sell using data invites pushback. So if you say to a 17-year-old, you know, the student debt, the average student debt is $25,000, they're going to say, well, I know that Jimmy's brother took out a much bigger loan, and there's all of this data denial. Also, for those of you who are parents of young people, you know long-term benefits are not compelling to a 17 or 18-year-old, right? So they want to understand the immediate impacts. They want to understand that from a voice that is credible, authentic, and believable. They want to know what their life is going to be like on campus. And this was very interesting to me as a Pell student, this idea of affordability. The term affordability is not as effective as framing costs as manageable. And that really resonated to me. If someone said, oh, college is affordable, I would have said, well, maybe to you, but probably not to me. The word manageable actually invites conversation about scholarships, about financial aid, about work-study opportunities. So framing costs as manageable is actually much more resonant, particularly with students who may be concerned about costs. Then on the right-hand side, Utah Valley, using their National Student Clearinghouse report to identify non-consumers, they actually found 3,500 students that had applied and then never enrolled anywhere. They did a targeted campaign to those students saying, we want you, we still want you here at Utah Valley. That campaign and outreach and frequent messaging resulted in 400 new enrollments. And then the University of Michigan, they have a HAIL scholarship, which is targeted at low-income, high-achieving students in Michigan. What they decided to do is to be more proactive in reaching out to high school seniors who would qualify for that scholarship, even before they had applied, to say, hey, you may not know about this HAIL scholarship, you might not even be considering Michigan, but if you do come here, you will be a HAIL scholar, and we would love to have you. So really creative, sort of scrappy strategies that are starting to be employed. There's a quote at the bottom by a president from a large public university that sort of captures us up our point of view as well, which is that higher ed isn't going to have a got milk moment with some magical messaging that fixes everything, that counteracts all of those narratives, right? We've got to start changing how we present ourselves to different student groups to solve different problems that are resonant with them. There is no got milk moment. Alex Usher, the great strategist out of Canada, has a saying that the 8 most damaging words in higher ed are, we've got to tell our story better. This is not just about fixing the messaging. We've got to understand what each student population needs. We've got to speak to their needs. This is a challenge that is hitting all of our sector. Okay, I'm going to move on to enrollment and demographics. And again, invite you, if you have questions, to feel free to interrupt me. This is a macro view of the enrollment picture across graduate, non-degree, and undergraduate. And what you see, and let me orient you because this is a slightly complicated graphic, in the gray is the decade prior to COVID, so 2010 to 2019. There are 2 bars in each of the unshaded and shaded areas. The bright blue is the top 20% of the market, and that is by enrollment size. And then the dark blue bar is the lower 80% of the market. So pre-pandemic and then pandemic, and then by size of institution. What we see on the graduate side is that there was strong growth across the pandemic. The top 20% actually enjoying most of that growth, that bright blue bar, and then continuing to see some growth across 2019 and 21. That has actually varied coming out of COVID, I will say, and very much by different program sets on the graduate side. On the non-degree side, we had a little bit of pre-pandemic growth in the gray, and then rapid declines, dramatic declines, particularly in the lower 80% since 2019. On the undergraduate side, in the gray shaded box, you see that the lower 80% of the sector has been declining since 2010. And then across COVID, the entire sector experiencing declines. So what I want to emphasize is that most of higher ed has been experiencing undergraduate enrollment declines for a decade. We may look at the graduate side and think, well, perhaps we can grow our way out of it on the graduate side, but undergraduates account for nearly 80% of tuition revenue across the sector. There has been a bit of enrollment recovery across the sector coming out of COVID, and we wanted to understand where, as a sector, that was coming from. So our researchers created different age cohorts, 18 to 20, 21 to 24, 25 to 29, and then age 30 and above, those adult learners. Each of the bars represents a different type of institution in higher ed. So the gray is public four-year institutions. The sort of teal is private, nonprofit four-year, so that would be American. The bright blue is private for-profit, and then the dark blue is the public 2 years. So we do see on the far right that there has been a little uptick for the age 30 and above population, but that is generally a small population. What we see across these bars is that the growth, that most of the recovery since COVID has come from that 18 to 20-year-old cohort. So what does this mean? It means if students like my children decided not to pursue higher education across COVID, or if they stopped out, we're not getting them back. So the recovery has largely been driven by new high school graduates, that 18 to 20-year-old cohort. We have not gotten them back if they stopped out or if they chose not to pursue college during COVID. This was particularly concerning to me this past year and actually for this coming year with the FAFSA situation, because that has impacted disproportionately lower income students. And again, we are not good at getting those students back if they choose to not come, if it's just too much for them to manage. This is another somewhat complicated graphic, so let me orient you to this. The horizontal axis is the average growth or annual percent change from the decade prior to COVID. So if you're on the right-hand side, you were growing in that decade prior to COVID. The vertical axis is 2019 to 21. So if you're higher up, you were growing across COVID. Each of the bubbles, the different colored bubbles, represent a different kind of institution. And then the size of the bubbles is the total undergraduate enrollments represented. So the larger the bubble, the more students, undergraduate students, are represented by that type of institution. So where you want to be is in that upper right-hand quadrant, growing before COVID, growing across COVID. Now, who do we see here? We see the large national, large elite, and small national institutions. And by national, we mean the ranked U.S. News and World Report rankings to 100. This is what we call a flight to size and selectivity. So the advantaged institutions were those large national and elite and small national and elite institutions. What you see on the lower left-hand side are our two-year colleagues are really suffering. They were declining in enrollments before COVID, and they continued to decline dramatically across COVID. So that's a bit on the enrollment side. I do want to introduce you to another concept, and I just heard an NPR podcast on this as well, that we're starting to hear this concept come into some of the popular discourse, but that is that the world population is going to peak. There are 3 estimates here that you see plotted on this chart. You have the UN projection. Their main projection is the bright blue line. Their faster, more recent revised projection is the dark blue line below it. And then the orange line is the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is out of the Gates Foundation. So if you synthesize all of these, somewhere around 2035, the world population is going to peak and then continue to decline. Each country is going to peak at different times. The US, somewhere around 2060, Canada, 2080, China already peaked in 22. Japan, where I spent a bit of time working in the 90s, and then I went back to visit this year, it peaked in 2010. And I will tell you, it was a very different Japan that I experienced on this visit in terms of the population demographics, so many more elderly. And Japan's not known as the most welcoming country in terms of policy, but they are changing that because they cannot fill the workforce. They cannot actually fill all of the positions they need. So they are starting to really open up their borders, or the borders of the island, to welcome in foreigners so that they can fill those positions. We have been obsessing about this demographic decline that is going to happen. That's what you see in the shaded bright blue area. The demographic cliff that Nathan Graw has been talking about, that represents 1.4 million fewer 15 to 19-year-olds. But look over that next hump. That is what we call that peak population decline, and it continues until 2100. It represents 4.3 million fewer 15 to 19-year-olds. In fact, 3 times the declines that were experienced across COVID. I mentioned that each country is experiencing this in a different way in different times. This has an impact on international students, right? And that's such an important part of our student population here at American. What we see in the blue lines are declining students, declining populations of 15 to 19-year-olds, and therefore declining student populations from India and China. Those for most of the sector have been really mainstays of international student recruitment. But you can see that those will decline all the way through 2100. There are a couple of lines that are increasing, right? North Africa and the Middle East, and then Nigeria in particular. And so that's certainly been a conversation across many campuses, is the advent of more Nigerian students. On the right-hand side, a couple of takeaways. By 2030, young Africans are expected to make up 42% of the world's youth population. So this is going to be a very important population for us to consider. In the last 2 years, actually, U.S. institutions saw 18% growth in students from Africa, and, as I mentioned, that 22% growth in students from Nigeria specifically. China, which has been such a mainstay, Chinese enrollments will peak in 2027 and then decline. This is very important because these changes have an impact on tuition and financial aid needs, right? So students from Africa have very different needs than perhaps wealthier students from Asia, where their families could actually support the full cost of tuition. And this has been happening for quite some time, this shift in financial aid need. In 2020, 64% of international student tuition and fees were already covered by aid. So while we see these shifting demographics happening, we need to think also about the different needs that these student populations will have to enroll and to succeed on campus. What does an aging population mean? Well, there is an old age dependency ratio that we should be tracking. It's basically the number of older individuals, 65 and above, for every 100 working age individuals. And the projection is that by 2050, the US old age dependency ratio will go up to 40%. And just to contextualize this, Japan right now is at 44%. And I will mention Japan has 2 million abandoned homes and if you remember the 90s in Japan, the real estate market was hot, hot, hot. They have 2 million abandoned homes because as these elderly have passed away, they don't have anyone to bequeath the homes to. So you can buy a home in Japan for $1 if you commit to fixing it up. That's one of the stories that sort of blows your mind. But Japan is at 44%. The US will reach 40% in 2050. Aging populations strain government budgets, right? We see a growth in Social Security spending. We certainly see a growth in healthcare spending. When states find that their budgets are strained, where they go first to balance the budget tends to be education. We saw this in the last Great Recession. We saw a 25% decline in state higher ed funding post the last Great Recession. And it never came back. It never came back. But K through 12 cuts may be the real threat. So what we have seen is for every $1,000 per capita cut in K through 12 spending, there is a 6% decline in the college going rate. And this actually is borne out if you look at regions across the US right now. The most poorly resourced K through 12 systems have the lowest college going rates, right? That sort of makes sense. So we need to keep that in mind as we are voting. We have an election year coming up. We have some folks who are saying they're going to do away with the Department of Education, and certainly there are repercussions for K through 12 spending, as well as higher ed funding. This all should be very forefront in our minds. We should be encouraging our young people to vote as well, all of those things. I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time and go to financial pressures on the business model. Before we get excited that all of these graphs are pointing up, these are all attributes of cost. The cost of running a university. On the upper left-hand side, the average yearly increase in the higher ed inflation rate got up to 5.2% in 2022. On the upper right-hand side, total asset backlog. This is deferred maintenance. So across COVID, we thought that might be a good time for universities to invest in all of that deferred maintenance, but gosh, we had a lot of other investments we needed to make sure our students could get online, that our classrooms could get online, that they could have access to vaccines. So we didn't put extra money into deferred maintenance. So total asset backlog has climbed to $133 per gross square foot. On the bottom left-hand side, the average yearly increase in higher ed staff wages. This largely driven by the inflationary environment. We need to pay our staff more because it costs more to live. And that on the lower right-hand side, the average tuition discount rate for first-time undergrad students. Across the United States, that reached 56.2% in 22. So that is the discount rate. And then, of course, HERF funds coming to an end. They were a lifeline across COVID. They came to an end. And so now we are facing very real constriction on the budget. Certainly, I know we have that situation at American. We are not alone, and we need to be very cognizant of this. Just a handful of other universities on this slide, but I will tell you this is a sector-wide challenge. West Virginia University with a $45 million budget deficit. DePaul, the largest Catholic institution in the country with a $56 million budget gap that they had to address. We also see even those institutions that are seeing budget surpluses, like Bates, trying to get ahead of the storm, tightening their belts because they see those eroding state allocations, they see the rising real estate and maintenance costs, the shifts in the international enrollment trends, the domestic undergraduate decline. So they actually, with a $3 million surplus, reduced programmatic spending by 5%. That's really getting ahead of the storm, having tough discussions in good times. There are some lessons to be learned from the last Great Recession. One of them is that blanket cuts are not the way to go. Blanket cuts tend to be unsustainable, and they can actually damage strategic capacity. That was borne out by a Gartner study that looked at this across industries after the last Great Recession. They found that 43% of organizations that did these sort of across-the-board blanket cuts, only 43% actually achieved the desired savings in the first year of those cuts, and only 11% of organizations were able to sustain those cuts in 3 years. And when you think about the way blanket cuts are made, that makes sense, right? It erodes sources of persistent value. If you're already running lean, you get penalized, and it locks in status quo processes. It asks the wrong questions. It's basically, let's tighten our belts and just do the same thing with fewer resources. The more important question is there a better way to get the work done? First of all, does the work need to get done? Because sometimes we're doing things just because we've been doing them for a long time. Does the work need to get done? If it does, is there a more efficient, a different way that we can accomplish that work across the institution? That's really the win. Re-engineering our business processes. And then across higher ed, the IPEDS analysis, the Delta Cost Project, bore out those same conclusions. 67% of institutions that had done these across-the-board cuts actually saw an increase in cost growth following that large cut. 45% of institutions actually saw a growth trajectory that exceeded the growth trajectory before a blanket cut. And that means that they were worse off than if they had never done the cut in the first place. Skip this slide to just say our perspective is that the 2000s might have been the time of more with more. If you build it, they will come. This was when campuses were building those meandering brooks through the middle of campus. The 2010s, for most institutions, was a time of more with less, right? Just get more efficient. The 2020s are going to be marked by a less with less approach, or it should be marked by a less with less approach. Or what I like to say is do less better. Make sure you understand the priorities, safeguard the priorities for our students, but also that means we need to say no to those things that are less of a priority so that we can really elevate the things to which we say yes. And we see that reflected in conversations with CBOs. So in 2022, only 4% of CBOs said their institutions were tightening their focus to be smaller but better. In 23, that was up to 18%. This year, I am sure it's going to climb. With that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Ed Venit.
All right, hello everyone. Hope you can hear me all right. If you thought those slides were data intensive, get ready for my slides. So, quick little background. I'm a DC native. I grew up very close by. In fact, my first experience at American University was 1993 at Bender Arena for a Dave Matthews concert. I think I was 16. Yeah, that was before he was big even. It was like 2,000 people there. All right, so I am going to just quickly touch on 3 different concepts to kind of close this out and give us a little bit of more of a on-the-ground student success challenge right now that a lot of you might be feeling today in your work with students. And then we're going to talk very little bit about AI very at the end here. So let's dive into that. All of my work these days is about looking at how to better support the students that you have right now and carry them through to graduation. Sally showed you a lot of the challenges with getting the students in the first place, and they will continue to be challenges going forward. There are also challenges associated with the students that you do get. So the first thing we're talking about is the academic preparation crisis, which is a direct after effect of the pandemic. A lot of students' learning got Swiss cheesed, essentially. They either weren't in school, or their teacher quit, or they couldn't share a device because they have 3 siblings and 1 device, or somebody got sick and passed away. Whatever it might be, learning got highly disrupted during the pandemic, and you can see it in the numbers. A lot of you are already anecdotally, perhaps even quantitatively, seeing it in your work with students in the classrooms or when they're just sitting directly across from you. The numbers are pretty stark. I'm sorry for the incredibly small font size for this one. It's usually a little bit of a larger slide, but I'm going to just narrate for you. The class that just finished their first year, the class of 23, when they took the ACT in high school, and it's taken universally in about 20 plus states, so this is a pretty good reliable measure. This is what it would have looked like in 2019 in terms of students who take the ACT who are ready to pass a college level class in the 4 main areas of the ACT. Don't be too disturbed by these numbers. These are all students taking this test, so a lot of these students aren't going to college. This is 4 years later, and what you can't see here, especially on the math bar right now, is a 9 percentage point decline in math preparedness. If you're feeling this in your work with students, it is real. And it is, of course, across the board in all subjects, but I'm particularly keen in here on math because it is so foundational to health and STEM and business and so many of the programs around campus. We'll have challenges with reading, but that tends to be younger students, and we'll enjoy that challenge a little bit farther down the road. So this is happening right now. There's also plenty of issues with socialization. We'll talk about mental health in just a moment. How long might this challenge go on? I'm a biologist by training, and we learn an important thing in biology school, which is that children very reliably get older 1 year at a time. No faster, no slower, exactly 1 year at a time. So we can see the future by looking at our current students and going a little further back in time. And so we're going to do that by looking at the class of, the incoming class of 2027. They just finished 9th grade. And again, doing that sophisticated analysis, we discovered they were in 8th grade the prior year. When they're in 8th grade, they took something called the iReady assessment. About 11 million students take it, and it essentially is, are you on pace for college and career readiness in academic areas? Here we're looking at math. This is majority enrollment at the school you went to, so look at this as a racial disaggregation along communities. And here's where we were in 2019, here's where we are now. So little gaps that you see here in this class. Some notes about this class, they are not really improving. So they have this gap, they are slightly improving, but they're unlikely to get back to par, whatever par would have been in 2019, by the time they arrive and sit in a classroom just like this. This is being felt by all different sorts of schools. I fielded a call from Princeton the other day about this. Less affluent students are about a year and a half behind. More affluent students are about half a year behind. It's being felt across the board in almost every school district. How long might it continue to go on? If you have one of these things living in your house, a 5th grader, they will be there until approximately the early 2030s. I hope that you're ready for that or have a very nice basement. But regardless, let's take a look at how they're doing on the iReady assessment. When they were in 4th grade, they, this is what they would have looked like. Younger students always do better on this assessment. That's why the bars are higher. But unfortunately, the gaps are pretty egregious when you look at this group. This is the incoming college class of 2031. And if you can't see the demographic disaggregation along the bottom, you're seeing some pretty hefty equity gaps for Latinx and for Black students. This is going to reverse equity gains that we've made over the last 20 years in terms of access to college, graduation from college, and then eventually will filter throughout society because this is our workforce of the future. But don't panic. There's a couple things we have going on for us here. First of all, younger students tend to be more malleable. We have a better chance to recover these students, and we have a lot more time. Also, this is not going to be invisible to the public for very much longer. In my own work, nobody was really talking about this issue 2 years ago. Now we're talking about it pretty regularly within this context. Eventually, parents, of which many of you are going to start talking about this as well. And then it will become much more of a national issue. Individual institutions, what can you do about this? I hear a lot of schools like American style schools doing things like summer programs. We're going to do more in the, not really boot camps, but kind of universal programs for all our incoming students to make sure that they are equipped and ready for a college level classroom. There's also schools of your ilk that are taking advantage of their gifted and talented programs, working with the students that would, you would normally then have your admissions office recruiting across the course of the next few years. Well, there's an opportunity there to bolster education. So this is a challenge that's coming our way and will continue to come our way for the next few years. This is now a new normal. And you as student success professionals need to take a close look at things like supplemental instruction programs. If you have an approach to developmental education, this is a good chance to take another look at it. If you don't feel like you have a strong approach to that, this is a good chance to get one. And here you are, preparing yourself for the future. So that's the academic preparation situation. I want to talk about mental health really quickly, and this is a little bit of an audience participation moment. Pull out your phone or any kind of device. This is something the presenter will never tell you to do while they're up on stage, but go ahead and do it. And pull up Google and enter the words, "college makes me feel." And then shout out what comes next. College makes me feel. Stupid. Like an idiot. Like a failure, that's a popular one. Depressed. Do you see any good words? Yeah, now this is not a these are students going to Google asking for help. This is not a representative sample, but this is a representative sample of how your students are perhaps feeling at a time when they're looking for advice. Why are they going to Google instead of you? This would be an important question to ask yourselves. Let's take a look at the mental health situation in terms of the needs of students. They've largely doubled over the last decade. This is 2013 to 2023 data, and I pulled 3 data points here. There are loads of data points in this study. They all say the same thing. We've had a doubling in anxiety diagnoses, doubling in depression diagnoses, doubling in the use of therapy. What's going on here? Well, there's 2 things that are going on here. The first is that the current crop of students, Gen Z, very, very mental health attuned. It's a destigmatized generation. They talk about these sort of concepts very fluidly. A lot of them have been going to therapy since they were small children and don't know any of their life, and that's potentially a very good thing. They also know a lot more about themselves than, say, I would have when I was attending a Dave Matthews concert in Bender Arena, or any other time of what it was they're doing whenever I was 16 and 17 years old. But the point being is that they're much more attuned to this, but they're also going to demand more from you as a result because they know what to ask for. They've also been accessing a lot of mental health care through their education institutions for quite some time now. So it's showing up a little bit in the retention numbers, and by a little bit I mean a lot. Been doing this work on student success now for almost 18 years, and historically speaking, we talk about things like, well, students leave college because it costs too much or it's too hard, they don't feel like they belong. They're not even sure what they're doing here. Is there a career outcome at their end? And all that stuff is still true. But post-pandemic, the survey data is revealing that mental health is actually the top reason why students are considering leaving school. And I'll show you the numbers right here. This is Gallup and Lumina. They've run this survey now 4 years in a row. In every single survey, every time they run it, this is the result that they get, so it's not really changing. Here are your kind of usual suspects right here. I don't feel like I belong here. It's too hard. It's too expensive. This is for students who had considered stopping out over the last 6 months, and they were allowed to select multiple reasons. You can already look up the look at the upper part of this graph and see that mental health reasons and emotional stress are going to far eclipse what were sort of the traditional reasons why students were leaving. So it's worth taking note of this. And to higher education's credit, we've responded. This is something that you're talking about a lot more now than you would have 2 years ago or 5 years ago, certainly pre-pandemic. Mental health is one of those disadvantages of being doubly siloed. It's siloed within the counseling center and then siloed within student affairs, typically speaking, and there's a lot of privacy concerns. Now campuses are talking about let's have a campus-wide wellness strategy. Yes, we've still got one-on-one counseling appointments in a clinical setting, but we're going to do a lot more for wellness because that's going to help more students not end up in that sort of setting, or perhaps divert some students who would have ended up there that can be treated and helped in other ways. So what does that look like? One of the great things of the work that we've been doing around mental health is how you can use technology and the existing structures you have to support mental health and wellness. And if you look at this, you'll see that these do not add up to 100, these numbers right here. And that is actually reflective of how wellness really works. It's not an isolated thing. It is intersectional in nature. So much so that the federal government defines 8 different dimensions of wellness in terms of, well, how we're well. And you can see them right here on this page with you in the middle or your students in the middle. There's all different sorts of wellness, and if you're not well in one of these areas, you're probably not feeling well, and they tend to have a knock-on effect. Think about this from a student perspective. If you're not doing well financially, you could be struggling emotionally and academically. If you're struggling emotionally, you might not be doing well physically, and so on and so forth around here. When we started to just take a step back and look at this sort of thing, we asked, how can a campus support student wellness by addressing all 8 dimensions? And it turns out you've already got all the stuff. You have all different sorts of offices and services around campus, including the faculty, including the rec center, the health center, the bursar's office, that are all wellness offices because they tap into one of these 8 dimensions of wellness. Let me put it in more plain terms. You all have a role to play here, and the role you have to play is just come in and do your job, because this is all supporting student wellness if you approach it from a certain standpoint. And I'm just going to use the bursar office because, well, you would think that that was just sort of a transactional office. If that student is having a challenge in that moment, paying their bill, they're having a wellness moment in that moment. And if that office or any other office intersecting with the student can acknowledge that and even deploy a little bit of wellness care in that moment, simply to acknowledge, I know this is hard, but this happens a lot, and we're going to help you get through this. We're here to support you. Well, that makes a big difference for that student, even in that exact moment of pretty deep stress. So a lot of the response here is, you all have a role to play, but you can do that simply by doing your jobs with care and a lot of empathy for the students in that particular moment. Another thing we've discovered is that as schools are trying to build out their mental health and wellness resources, more and more we hear about something called a stepped care model. And I know that this is something that you've been thinking a lot about at AU. This is where the traditional types of mental health care are typically thought of. It's clinical referrals, one-on-one counseling, it's therapy. Well, that all still exists, but for a lot of schools, it's hard to hire enough counselors. So you have the benefit of being in a large, diverse metropolitan area with access to those sort of staff. Not every school can be able to do that. I would suspect you still don't fully have the capacity you need to serve your students. So more and more schools are looking to outsourcing telehealth, those sort of providers. And that's a good thing. Those providers are coming along a lot right now, becoming much more sophisticated. The larger strategy, though, is down here at the bottom of the stepped care model. And this is outside of a clinical setting, not really protected by HIPAA. A lot of these things are just communication strategies. And as you can tell from the breadth here, they're covering more students at a less intensive and perhaps less expensive way of approaching wellness. So you're talking about things like building self-knowledge for students, creating peer communities, and also just simply communicating with students things like get 8 hours of sleep, eat well, take your meds, that sort of stuff, which, if you're an 18-year-old, you might not remember to do as well. And so here's where we see the investments happening. There's a lot of attention to add clinical capacity, either through hiring or through a third-party provider. And then there's the use of our CRM technologies to simply communicate better with students about the access to things that we have around campus and make sure that they're getting connected. Again, this is a great moment to use the assets you already have in place to support wellness in a new way, and you can do this today. All of my work these days, and I'm just going to close out quickly on this one. We have one more slide. All of my work is really about looking to the future. This is kind of an unprecedentedly disruptive time in higher ed. Hopefully these slides have convinced you of that if you weren't already convinced. And what might the future might look like. So I have gone and done a little bit of training in strategic foresight to be able to use data points like the ones we've showed you today to get a sense of where we might be going. And here are 4 of the futures future stories that we've come up with. I'm not going to get into this today, but if you'd like to read more about this, Google 4 future scenarios for student success. You'll get to a nice infographic on eaba.com that will get into it. I do want to talk about one of the futures, and that's the one in the upper right. This is generally considered a positive future. It's a future in which schools are able to move to be much more student-centered in how they approach students. I've been saying things like student-centered university for 10 years and found that nobody really knows exactly what that really means. And maybe you have your own definitions, or it's just simply a motivating kind of phrase. But for me, in this context, I'm defining it as personalized college delivered at scale. You might be, as a student, having a different experience than your roommate, even though you attend the same institution and are in the same major. And that's going to be because schools are going to be able to move, if we go into this positive future, into a world where AI helps us deliver far more individualized, tailored care to each of our students. And I'm just going to paint a picture of you, and this will be the last slide we do before we can maybe handle a question or two. What would a fully AI-enabled student success institution look like? And we are going to show you a map here of all kind of different ideas that either are already popping on the scene or are being discussed with such a level of maturity that we would expect to see them in the next year or two. So what we're not going to talk about here are things like academic dishonesty or bias. These are really important conversations around AI, but they're being handled in other contexts. This is more about the tools that you might be able to use in order to better support students, again, at a personalized scale. So let's see what we might hit. If you are over on the admissions side of things, you're trying to bring students in, you might be getting help using generative AI to fill out paperwork internally. Maybe you have forms that you need to keep track of. Very common application is to write customized outreach to students. This is an AI generating an email to a student based on your records of the student, and it feels very personal. It could also be in their native language if you don't speak that, which is a really interesting moment, especially if you're communicating with parents. Application concierge. Well, imagine a 24/7 chatbot. Like I have interacted quite a bit recently with the Home Depot one. I'm doing a home renovation. Pretty decent chatbot, but we have the same sort of things that are out there now answering students' questions around all different sorts of admissions stuff. And then could you imagine a future where we have generative AI that's helping us do fairer, more holistic evaluations of students by reading potentially in a de-biased way? I was a reader for 2 years at my undergraduate institution, and I'm sure I made a lot of really biased, terrible decisions back then, but I'd love to have an assistant like that along the way. On the academic side of things, we have a future coming where we might be able to have adaptive courses and adaptive majors, personalized evaluation schemes that are, let's break through the curve and instead evaluate students based on their expectations or their own expectations of themselves. So there's a lot of experimentation that could be happening here. On the administration side of things, you're looking at service desks and things along those lines. This is often the beachhead where you see a lot of AI showing up already, again, in the form of things like chatbots. Over on student success, a lot of exciting things. If you've got an application concierge, why not an advising concierge? And indeed, this is something that EAB is thinking a lot about with our technologies. We have an ability to sort of scoop up your student catalog and every kind of PDF you've ever given a student and have an AI answer questions for students about that sort of thing at 3 in the morning when you would all prefer to be asleep. A personalized tutor. This is a really exciting moment. AI can teach you things and also test you on things. Already, you can use ChatGPT like that. In the near future, you'll have AIs that are able to read a syllabus and then read a student's academic record and realize, well, based on the fact that you didn't really learn this particular thing in high school, you're going to really struggle in the 3rd week of this pre-calculus course. You just don't know, you don't have the foundational knowledge. But good news, I'm an AI. I can deploy myself to be a supplemental instructor just for you in the 3rd week to get you through that moment. Your roommate, who's having in the same class, having a different experience, had a different experience in high school, they're going to struggle in the 6th week. And their AI is going to deploy themselves in that particular moment. We're not that far away from being able to do that right now. And so this is a pretty exciting moment for how you might be able to beat back that academic preparation problem, or at least address it using advanced technologies like AI. How about careers? An AI career coach that helps you along the way understand the career value of everything you're doing on campus and maybe even builds a resume for you out of it. Wouldn't that be exciting? I would love to have had that, and I would not have been the student showing up at the Career Center in April of my senior year. That's how you end up in grad school. Yes. If you can write customized emails to students you're trying to recruit, why not to the students that you already have? And indeed, that's something that a lot of our student success people are already doing. I'm sure many of you have done that exact thing in your work over the last year. Workflow support of all sorts. How many of you ever tried to use ChatGPT or any other generative AI in a grant application? Grant applications are a lot of fun, right? We all love filling those out. No one likes a grant application. But this is a place where you may be able to get some additional money for your initiatives that you're trying to fund, like say from a Gates Foundation or Illumina. And then lastly, AI enables, perhaps for the first time, for our tiny little human brains to understand what really works for student success. This is a complex system in which inputs are not often able to be directly tied to outputs. So we're making a lot of kind of guesses. Hey, this seems like a good thing. We sort of saw some numbers move. That was probably a good initiative that we put in place. But it's hard to disaggregate and tell what works and what doesn't. AI may have the ability, and we're getting there, to be able to point out, well, this has been particularly effective at this institution in this major for this kind of student, and you should do more of this. And as we get more skilled with using AI to do analyses like that, overall our student success initiatives will not only become more effective, but also more efficient in a less with less future. That's a really nice thing to be seen. So this is the last slide we have, but I want to sort of give a little bit of guidance on how you might move yourself towards an AI future in little ways. We have done a lot of surveying of folks just like you, student success professionals. About half of you are using AI at least once a week already to do your work. But it's typically happening kind of like this, Like under the desk, you don't want necessarily anybody to know you're doing it, and you certainly aren't talking about it so much with your colleagues. So in addition of sending, say, a centralized AI policy, something that we're encouraging schools to do is to create safe spaces for you to share ideas with each other and say, hey, I did this thing with AI. It turned out to be really cool. You should give it a try. And then, of course, your friend's telling you, well, I did a totally different thing, and check this out. We are in that stage of learning about this. So bring it out of the shadows and start talking about it. Again, you can have your conversations around academic dishonesty and all the other things that we're concerned about with AI. But in terms of the basic things you can do with generative AI right now, it's time to start talking about it with your colleagues. And again, just sort of sharing back and forth about kind of the cool things you're doing with it and what you're learning, because we are still in a pretty baby stage for this technology, but it's not going anywhere. So that's my little charge for you in the room right now. If you're moving towards a future where you would like to be doing more personalized support for students, well, you have the tools to do it right now, and just a matter of sharing ideas back and forth. I think that's what we have for you today. We have a couple minutes for sort of closing this out and maybe some questions. Sally, do you want to come back up? Oh, fantastic. Okay, so let's approach that.
Do we have a question in the room?
Oh, come on up to the microphone if you wouldn't mind. Oh, you got there first, so go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Then he gets to go first.
That's hilarious.
This is a less with less feature. You can say no.
Hi everyone, I'm Pete I'm the AU Career Center. Thank you so much. I love data. This is wonderful. I'm also a regular consumer of Ph.D. in Alger, both data and resources and webinars. So a lot of this it's depressing, was from everywhere.
Yes.
Right? Especially in some of the earlier slides, you had that sort of the reality versus what the perception is. I'm wondering if you could pick maybe 2 or 3 of those and talk about how we can, at AU specifically, try to affect positively some of the perceptions or some of the issues that we're dealing with.
Yes. And thank you. And I know that was a sobering run, so I appreciate you staying with me. And it's hard to palate that first thing in the morning, but I do think it's important context. So our view is that we don't win this by shouting back into the echo chamber. It is by deeply understanding the different student groups and populations that are right fit students for American and speaking to them in language that resonates with them. This is work that you all already have started. Even the idea of change makers and that strategic plan was rooted in differentiating the value proposition of American. I think that probably needs to continue in a post-COVID world with a different lens and a different frame. There's probably new learning that we can have, but it is about continuing that work, but also getting to the specifics around different student groups and what they need to hear in their language. And so that is what we're seeing. It's sort of own your backyard idea. We are not going to win this in the echo chamber. So. Thank you. Yes, your question.
Just checking my notes because I was paying attention when you were talking about stepped care. And my question, which connects with what I just Better?
Yes.
Okay. I was paying attention when you were talking about stepped care. And this connects a little bit to Gihan's world. Gihan is the head of our career services. I'm sort of connected with his world. I do scholarships advising. My question is, so many of our students now assume and expect and default to virtual appointments because it's more convenient for their schedules. And so my question is whether the positive benefits of everybody chipping in apply when the interaction is virtual.
Yeah, so a lot of your interactions with students, thank you, that was a great question. A lot of your interactions with students are going to be virtual just in the course of events these days. Even if they're physically living on campus right now, they may be taking a virtual class, for instance. So that's a sort of normal expectation. They live in those worlds. So for them, we haven't really seen too much of a change if that's an environment you want. Well, we know enough about students or just people in general right now. Some of them prefer a fully in-person environment. Some prefer more of a virtual environment. They're more comfortable in that world, especially with something like, say, a mental health conversation where you're comfortable at home. And then some are going to kind of go back and forth. My own personal life, my therapist is in Friendship Heights. I live in Cleveland Park. I've never met him in real life. So we're talking about 3 Mentor stops in that regard, and it works perfectly well for me in that way. So the sort of loss of efficacy in that regard doesn't seem to be there if the students themselves are choosing that pathway to speak with you versus it being forced on them, like say by a pandemic, for instance, and we only have the one avenue. Yeah.
I had a quick thing in response to that too. When we're thinking about virtual, that we have our own data that only about half of our students say that they have a faculty member that they feel they can go to, and only about a third of our students say that they have a staff member that they can go to. And one of the first things that President Alger talked about was the importance of relationships. And so being able to build those relationships with our students in our residential campus remains incredibly important. So
We really
I know
love
there's so many other things here too, but yeah.
Can I put in plug for the red folder really quick? Yeah, there's a resource out there from Stanford University called the Red Folder. Stanford Red Folder is the Google for it, is a publicly available pre-scripted thing that if you have a student right in front of you having a crisis, questions you can ask that student to help diagnose what's going on there very quickly, and then figure out, okay, I can say this to them, or this student's having a real problem, I need to call 911, or anywhere in between that. It's publicly available, it's a great resource, and we encourage everybody to take a look at it.
I am so sorry. I hate to be the buzzkill here. I know there's so many good questions, but we are short on time, and I just wanted to give our speakers who have come to campus today a big round of applause and a thank you for being here with us. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. And they're happy to stay through the break. So if you did have questions, please feel free to come up and speak with them directly. I will catch you all at the next session, which is our Thriving Spotlights Champions for Student Success session. And please fill out the session evaluation for this one. That's all for my reminders, and I'll see you soon.